The stranded astronauts are finally home. After a planned 8-day mission to the ISS, Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams splashed down near Florida to a hero's welcome. You've probably heard this all over the news recently. The crew missed family events, birthdays and Christmas, while engineers tried to determine if Boeing's Starliner capsule was safe to return on. It feels unprecedented to end up spending way more time in space than you originally planned for. But it's actually not. It's happened quite a few times before. From an actor taking your seat to another broken spacecraft and your home country disappearing from the world map. These are the stories of the stranded astronauts you weren't told about. Before we begin, let's just clarify what we mean by stranded. Any astronaut or cosmonaut that flies to the International Space Station must have a vehicle to return home in if something were to go wrong. So even while the crew member's original ride might not have been usable or ready, there is always an emergency plan in place and always a ride home available in a worst case scenario. In the case of Butch and Sonny, Starliner was still their emergency return vehicle right up until it departed the ISS without them on board. From that point on, the SpaceX Crew 8 Dragon was their lifeboat, so to speak, until the SpaceX Crew 9 Dragon arrived, which is the mission they were then co-opted into. With all of that in mind, let's begin with the time the filming of a movie caused a NASA astronaut to spend nearly a year in space. Mark Vande Hei is a spaceflight veteran. Joining NASA in 2009, he first flew aboard a Russian Soyuz rocket as part of the Expedition 53-54 crew in 2017. He spent just under 5 months on board the orbiting laboratory, including conducting a spacewalk, before returning in early 2018. So it was no surprise when just 3 years later it was announced Mark would fly again on board a Soyuz, this time for Expedition 64/65. On April 9, 2021, Vande Hei, along with cosmonauts Oleg Novitsky and Pyotr Dubrov, blasted off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, starting the timer on what would become, at the time, the longest single spaceflight by an American. While Mark was training for his planned 6-month mission, talks were underway in Russia. Director Klim Shipenko had the desire to film a movie on board the ISS, the first fiction film actually shot in space. To do this, he partnered up with Roscosmos, the production company Yellow, Black and White, and state-controlled television network Channel 1 to make Vyzov, or The Challenge in English. In the film, Yulia Peresild, who's not a cosmonaut but an actress who auditioned for the role and then went through vigorous training in Star City, plays a thoracic surgeon who launched on an emergency mission to save the life of an alien cosmonaut. The film would require 12 days in space to get all of the shots, with some of the Russian cosmonauts already in space getting a role in the film. The goal, according to Roscosmos, was to promote the Russian space program and glorify it in the hopes of getting more Russians involved in their space program. To get Yulia and the director to the space station, they would need to fly aboard a Soyuz vehicle. It just so happened that the MS-19 mission would be ready to launch when they wanted to film in October of 2021. The only problem is that the Soyuz has 3 seats, and 2 were needed for the movie. So instead of flying a crew to replace Pyotr and Mark, the vehicle would have to launch with Commander Anton Shkaplerov, the actress and the director. Once in space, Anton would become a part of the active ISS expedition, allowing Oleg Novitsky to return home after his 6-month stay. With no ride home, that meant Mark would have to wait for the next crew rotation Soyuz, which was another 6 months from being ready. Because of this, it doubled his stay aboard the station to 355 total days, adding him to the Expedition 66 crew. While getting stuck in space for another 6 months because someone wants to film a movie is unusual and could be frustrating, Mark knew this was a possibility and actually found it exciting.
I think all astronauts are explorers at heart, and having the opportunity to contribute to furthering exploration is a great opportunity. My family's been braced for this. I've been braced for this. It's something that we expected, and honestly, it's got a sense of novelty to it for me. It's a new experience, and I'm looking forward to, as a human being, understanding how it feels to do something like this.
Someone who didn't know they might be getting extra time in space, similar to Butch and Sonny, is NASA astronaut Frank Rubio. Frank was assigned to fly aboard the Soyuz MS-22 spacecraft and spend 6 months in space as a part of Expedition 67/68. However, that 6 months would turn into the record for the longest single spaceflight by an American, beating Mark's record. Typically, whatever capsule a crew arrives in is the same capsule they'll return home in. Each one is designed to spend about 200 days, or approximately 6 months, attached to the ISS and then safely bring the crew back. So that's the spacecraft Frank was expecting to once again ride home in with cosmonauts Sergei Prokopyev and Dmitry Petelin. The mission clock for the crew of 3 began on September 21st, 2022. All was going well until December 15th, when it started snowing outside the International Space Station. You could probably already see the problem. It shouldn't be snowing 400 kilometers above the ground.
Russian flight controllers and the flight controllers here at Mission Control in Houston have been noticing a stream of particles coming out of the Soyuz MS-10 vehicle that is attached to the Rassvet module on the Earth-facing side of the Russian segment.
At the same time, data from multiple pressure sensors in the cooling loop showed low readings. This happened just as the cosmonauts were preparing to conduct an unrelated spacewalk, which, needless to say, was cancelled. With all of the coolant vented out into space, engineers worried that the crew could see temperatures over 40 degrees Celsius, that's 100 degrees Fahrenheit, on the way home, which, while you're already blasting through Earth's atmosphere, leaving a trail of plasma, could get very dangerous very quickly. That's in addition to the fact that the crew are squeezed into their Sokol spacesuits and that you can barely fit 3 abreast into Soyuz. Roscosmos blamed it on a strike from a micrometeoroid hitting the line, although there's been some questions about how true that really is. Nearly 2 months to the day that Soyuz MS-22 started its snow machine, the cargo resupply Progress MS-21 also started snowing. Now, in the case of MS-21, it wasn't an issue because it's designed to burn up in the atmosphere, but it is rather peculiar that both the Soyuz and the Progress, 2 spacecraft which share similar designs throughout, sprang near identical leaks at a rather similar time. This fiasco ended up leaving the 3 men without a ride home, or as some media outlets might put it, stranded. What would happen if something went wrong and they needed to evacuate? Roscosmos decided that they could probably get their 2 crew members back, but adding a 3rd person would create more heat. So for the first time in history, NASA removed a Soyuz seatliner and placed it inside a Crew Dragon. The seatliner is a special mould made to the shape of each individual flyer on a Russian rocket, which is used to ease the loads of gravity after being weightless for so long. The plan was similar to the contingency scenario for Butch and Suni. If they couldn't use their vehicle in the event of an on-orbit emergency, they would move Frank to Crew Dragon and hitch a ride with the Crew 5 astronauts who were up there at the same time. Roscosmos made the decision to send the MS-22 spacecraft home without anyone on board and launched the MS-23 spacecraft empty as well. The damaged Soyuz did a super fast deorbit, 55 minutes compared to the usual 2.5 hours, and made it back in one piece. According to NASA, the temperatures were indeed very high, but not as bad as they originally expected. Regardless, it took a lot of time to get that next Soyuz ready and make sure there were no issues with it. That meant Frank would go on to spend over a year in space. As of this recording, he still holds the record for an American, with 371 consecutive days in space, finally returning home with his original 2 crewmates on September 27th, 2023. While Butch and Suni missed major holidays like Christmas with their family, Frank ended up missing some major milestones in his children's lives during those extra 6 months.
We had our oldest finish off her plebe year at the Naval Academy, and then our our son headed off to West Point. Just big challenges as they apply for and start off their college and young adult careers. But at the same time, we felt some incredible love and support and just the prayers from our family and friends, our community. They just came around us and supported us. And honestly, seeing the support that my family was getting made it so much easier to be up here and focus on the mission. Because it just took that weight off my shoulders. And, it was also, like, as much as it was a challenge for me as a father to miss all those things, it was also a pretty proud moment to see Deb and the kids just thrive and overcome. And I'm sure they missed me, but at the same time, we all took on the challenge together, and it was just really neat to see them just have a great attitude throughout the past year.
But if we want to talk about the original stranded astronauts aboard the ISS, we need to go all the way back to Expedition 6 in 2002 and 2003. Anybody who followed the Space Shuttle program can already see where this is going just by those years. Ken Bowersox, Don Thomas and cosmonaut Nikolai Budarin were getting ready to launch aboard Space Shuttle Endeavour to begin their long-duration stay aboard the station when the mission encountered its first issue. Thomas had to be removed from the mission due to medical concerns, which meant his backup, Don Pettit, would take his place. Their mission clock started on November 25, 2002, when they took off from historic Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center, docking to the station just a few days later. They were planned to stay aboard the station until the next shuttle, Atlantis, visited on the STS-114 mission in March 2003. However, before Atlantis would fly, NASA had one more mission on the back burner that they needed to complete so they could resume ISS construction and meet the goal of having it fully built by 2005. The mission was a science-focused flight which had the designation of STS-107. With it being the first shuttle built, it had a little bit of extra mass on board, so Columbia had not been fitted with a docking port to dock to the ISS, so it was perfectly suited for an orbital science mission. That mission launched on January 16, 2003. During the launch, a piece of foam insulation was seen falling off the orange external tank and striking Columbia's wing. When the vehicle went to re-enter on February 1st, the hole created by the foam strike led to a burn-through and the loss of the vehicle and her crew of 7. This would lead to the grounding of the Space Shuttle fleet for 2 years. That meant Ken and Don no longer had a ride home as they remained aboard the ISS. No NASA astronaut, at the time, had ever flown in the Russian capsule before, at least for a return to Earth. Docked to the ISS was the TMA-1 spacecraft, which would soon become the return vehicle for the Americans. That meant, however, 2 more months in space. Following the launch of SpaceX's Crew 10 in 2025, Ken Bowersox addressed his mindset during this time.
On my most recent flight, I did get to stay a little bit longer than we planned, and I was so happy that we did get to stay longer. The reasons were terrible that we stayed longer on our mission. But one of the positives about everything that happened was more time in space. And Don Pettit is up there right now. I flew with Don 20 years ago. The only time we ever came closer to an argument in space was when we argued over who might get to stay longer, because they were talking about having us extend for an extra 6 months and spend a year in space. Neither one of us got to, so we both got home, and then he eventually won that because he flew again and is still up there now.
He talked off camera with NSF's Sawyer Rosenstein afterwards and said, quote, "Don't worry, they were calling us stranded back then too." The crew of 3 who launched on the shuttle had quite a wild return to Earth, with this being the first version of the then upgraded Soyuz TMA. To say it encountered some small issues would be an understatement. On May 4th, 2003, the capsule began its re-entry. However, rather than the usual smoother ride, it began a ballistic re-entry, subjecting the crews to more than double the planned G-forces of a normal Soyuz landing. It was so violent that it ripped off a communications antenna, and the backups failed to deploy, meaning they were in a complete radio blackout. They were finally able to use a backup transmitter, which led recovery forces to the capsule around 300 miles short of the planned landing area. Soyuz TMA-1 would be Ken Bowersox's last of 5 missions. A few years after his return, he retired from NASA altogether to become SpaceX's Vice President of Astronaut Safety and Mission Assurance before resigning from SpaceX and returning to NASA, where he currently serves as the agency's Associate Administrator of the Space Operations Mission Directorate. His crewmate Don Pettit actually flew twice more, and he was actually aboard the ISS when Butch and Suni made their return home. While it may not have been for as long, another crew was left with uncertainty on their ride home following a rare Soyuz launch abort. Soyuz MS-10 launched on June 6, 2018, bringing a truly international crew to the International Space Station. Cosmonaut Sergei Prokopyev, German astronaut Alexander Gerst, and NASA astronaut Serena Auñón-Chancellor would join the Expedition 56 and 57 crews and stay aboard the ISS until some point after the arrival of the Soyuz MS-10 spacecraft in the October of that same year. Despite finding a hole inside the MS-09 spacecraft, which appeared to be caused by somebody with a drill, that's a whole different story. Everything was on track for the launch of MS-10, a brief joint handover period, and then a ride back to Earth. On October 11th, the Soyuz MS-10 spacecraft lifted off from Gagarin Start Site 15 with Alexei Ovchinin and Nick Hague bound for the ISS. But just a few minutes after liftoff, something went wrong with the booster. Following the separation of Stage 1, which on Soyuz are the strap-on boosters, a collision happened with the bottom of the second stage, aka the main center booster. This caused the second stage to, as Roscosmos put it, disintegrate. This led to the activation of the Soyuz's emergency abort system, pulling the crew of 2 away from the damaged rocket and subjecting the crew to nearly 7 times Earth's gravity. Most importantly, the crew walked away alive. This, however, would mean a delay in Soyuz flights while the cause was investigated. So what did that mean for the MS-09 crew already in space? The options were limited. As we've mentioned before, Soyuz can only last for about 200 days before it needs to return home based on its ratings for radiation exposure and other environmental needs. That meant in December, they would need to return home to allow for some margin. if they waited until January, they'd be pushing it. Keep in mind, this was when there were only 3 people aboard the ISS at a time, so if these 3 returned home, that would mean the station would have nobody on board. It could be done, but it's something all of the international partners wanted to avoid at all costs. So it all came down to the investigation. By the end of October, Roscosmos had pinned down the cause. A ball joint supporting one of the side boosters was deformed during assembly, preventing the proper separation of the side booster, colliding with the center core and leading to the abort. Since there was no significant issue with the systems on the spacecraft, Russia decided to give the next launch the go-ahead, and on December 3rd, less than 2 months after the abort, Oleg Kononenko, Anne McLean and David Sanjak lifted off aboard Soyuz MS-11, allowing the crew of 3 that had been awaiting the crew handover to finally return on December 20th. In case you're wondering, Alexei and Nick both flew on the following Soyuz MS-12 spacecraft and made it safely to space. However, the title of being stranded doesn't just apply to the ISS. If we go back to the Soviet space station Mir, one cosmonaut didn't get to go home because he had no country to go home to. Sergei Krikalev is one of the most experienced space flyers in history, with a total of more than 800 days in space. He first flew to Mir in November of 1988, where he stayed for just under 6 months. So it was no surprise when the Soviet Union called on him to fly again. Along with Anatoly Artsebarsky and the first British astronaut Helen Sharman, the Soyuz TM-12 spacecraft lifted off from the steppes of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic on May 18, 1991 to start Krikalev's long-duration clock. Sharman returned with the crew that was already aboard Mir, leaving Sergey and Anatoly to conduct signs during their 6-month stay. The pair performed 6 spacewalks during the mission, while the political landscape 400 kilometers below was changing. Tanks rolled through Moscow's Red Square as Gorbachev stepped aside, marking the beginning of the end for the USSR. The crew of 2 was watching what was happening and concerned for what this would mean, bringing them home. There was a capsule docked to Mir that they could use to get home at any point, so it was physically possible. However, unlike the ISS, the Soviet station could not fly without anyone on board, so if the crew left, that would mean the end of the orbiting laboratory. One major question remained: did the Soviet Union even have enough money to launch another crew? They began working on getting contracts and selling seats to Westerners on Soyuz spacecraft, with seats going for about $21 million in an effort to raise money. In October of 1991, a new crew finally arrived, carrying 2 cosmonauts and 1 Austrian astronaut. Once it docked, now came the question, who would stay? While 3 people launched, only 1 crew member was trained for long-duration spaceflight. The other 2 were just scientists. After nearly 5 months in space, it was determined Anatoly would return home, and Commander Alexander Volkov would become the newest resident of Mir. But Krikalev, through all of this hoo-ha, was not coming home just yet. 2 Progress resupply vehicles were launched to give the crew members the food, water, oxygen and other supplies to survive, while the now defunct Soviet Union turned Russian Federation decided what to do with its crew still in space. They continued their exercise routines, performed science and even conducted another spacewalk. Finally, in early 1992, word made it to Mir that Krikalev would finally return home. The new long-duration crew, along with a German scientist, hitched a ride from the now independent Republic of Kazakhstan and docked in March. Alexander and Sergey took the Soyuz TM-13 spacecraft home and stopped the long-duration mission clock on March 17, 1992. There was still one small problem though. Krikalev still had his Soviet Union passport, which had ceased to exist for a few months at this point. His hometown of Leningrad, now renamed St. Petersburg. This landing earned him the nickname of the last ever member of the USSR. And if you want to go even further back to what you might consider the original stranded astronauts, we need to go back to 1979. Admittedly, the media never called them stranded, but that's more of a Soviet state-sponsored media propaganda issue than a not being able to return home issue. Vladimir Lyakhov and Valery Ryumin boarded their Soyuz 32 spacecraft on their way to the Salyut 6 space station on February 25, 1979. The station had already been up in space for about 2 years and needed a major overhaul for future long-duration crews. After conducting medical experiments, using a space shower, and even the first ever in-space soldering, the crew received one resupply vehicle ahead of the arrival of the Soyuz 33 spacecraft. That would signal their turn to ride home. That Soyuz 33 mission launched on April 10th with all systems nominal. However, as it approached the station, the automatic docking system was activated and commanded a 6-second burn. After only 3 seconds, the engine shut down. Similar to what Boeing tried with Starliner, they restarted the system and tried again. However, unlike Starliner, when they tried again, it also shut down prematurely. The crew inside the capsule reported violent shaking, and the cosmonauts aboard Salyut 6 noted an unusual glow from behind Soyuz. At this point, the docking was called off. The Soyuz did have a backup second engine that the crew wanted to use, but the ground denied that option. The concern was if it misfired, they could be stuck in a spacecraft that would deorbit naturally in 10 days with only 5 days worth of supplies and carbon dioxide scrubbers. A pressure sensor in the combustion chamber was shutting down the engine, preventing an explosion. It was later determined it was in fact a faulty engine. Of all the possible options, the space station could have been moved closer to the capsule. However, at this point the Soyuz was already backing away from the station, and that would have used a lot of fuel. They also didn't want to risk having a spacecraft with a faulty engine and 4 people stuck on the small station. As a reminder, Salyut 6 was a single-module space station. It wasn't a multi-module behemoth like Mir or the ISS. So instead, the 2 crew members from Soyuz 32 would remain stuck on Salyut 6. The Soyuz 33 capsule used its backup engine I mentioned a moment ago to deorbit. However, it fired up 30 seconds longer than planned, leading to a ballistic re-entry that subjected the crew of 2 to 10 Gs. That's 10 times the gravitational force you feel on Earth. The crew were recovered safely though. When the news was sent up to Vladimir and Valery that they would be stuck in space longer, they reportedly grumbled and immediately cut communications with the ground. According to reports, this meant tension between the crew and controllers for multiple days after the announcement. With concerns that the same engine issue could happen to the capsule that they launched in, it was decided that the Soyuz 32 spacecraft would return with just supplies and experiments back to Earth, and the crew would not be aboard. The design of the Soyuz engines was reworked on the ground, and on June 6th, a new Soyuz 34 capsule was launched, docking shortly thereafter with the station. After a few more months of science, the 2 cosmonauts finally were given the go-ahead to return home. The new engine design worked as expected, and on August 19th, 1979, 175 days after launching on a different capsule, Lyakhov and Ryumin landed back on Earth. At the time, that set a long-duration spaceflight record. So with all of this added context, do you think Butch and Suni were actually stranded in space? And for that matter, do you think any of the other crews mentioned in this video were also stuck in space? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. I've been Ryan Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.